I just want to let people know that when times were really bad and I was down and out and couldn't find any help, Steve Zeltzer helped and spread the word, and he was such a good support for me and several other injured workers who are just, as anybody knows who's gone through this, so isolated. So thank you, Steve, in the biotech arena. My fight was against Pfizer, the largest pharmaceutical company in the world. In 2010, a jury in a federal court unanimously decided that Pfizer had used willful and wanton misconduct against me, free speech on safety issues of public concern. The jury understood free speech is critical and critically important because workers are front line, not only for their own safety, but also in keeping the public safe and informed. Despite the great victory for free speech, what I learned through the process should be a concern for all of you who sit in this audience today and who live within the East Bay Green Corridor, where multiple biolabs are being seeded. And that is, there are no adequate regulations, no oversight, and no workers' rights within this industry to protect you. And even more concerning is the current state of our biomedical academic community, which is rife with conflicts of interest. All these together put the public at a substantial risk for harm. Now, I'm a 23-year career molecular biologist. I have a bachelor's degree in biology from the University of Indiana University, I'm sorry, and a master's in public health. And I do have 23 years of advanced molecular biology experience. Most of it was working in publicly funded academic institutes, such as Baylor College of Medicine or MD Anderson Cancer Institute, and then a little bit I went to New Zealand at the University of Otago. I've worked on molecular engineering projects involving developmental biology, human genetic disease, neurobiology, vaccine design, and lastly, when I was working at Pfizer, I was designing and developing state-of-the-art genetic technologies for embryonic stem cells. Now let me give you a taste of the technologies, and these technologies are being performed in most academic institutes. They're not uncommon. Basically, I was making disease state models, and you have to make models disease so you can find cures for disease instead of experimenting on humans. So we try to make cells have disease state models, and you can do this through genetic manipulations. One of the technologies I was using was something called shRNA, but in layman's term, I'm going to compare it to building missiles on a molecular level. You must be all familiar with the Tomahawk cruise missile that's launched from a ship in the ocean, has some sort of GPS on it, and destroys a targeted building 1,000 miles away. Well, we have those same technologies on a molecular level, and I was designing and developing those technologies to make disease state models. Now, the actual genetic material I was working with wasn't dangerous, but if you put those in human infectious viruses, then they become dangerous because they can target a gene destruction and cause metabolic disorders, cancer, neuropathy, any type of a whole variety of illnesses in humans. So I think the audience should realize that these advanced technologies that are being used in BioLevel 2 labs, which is your standard academic laboratory, are a risk if they are not biocontained. So what safety issues did I face at Pfizer? Well, there was a variety of issues. There were chemical contamination, radioisotope contamination. There was a blood-borne pathogen and genetically engineered biocontainment issues. For example, we found a genetically engineered virus where we eat and drink. Other things. I'm not going to go into I can go on and on how many problems we had in our department. There were no adequate break rooms. Our break room was a working hallway where pathogens were being transported and placed on where we eat and drink. There was no safe office space, so people would bring in dangerous technology, sometimes with our knowledge, sometimes without our knowledge, at our office, right by our office space, where we couldn't have personal protection. People started falling ill in our laboratory, in our department, through various exposures. So I and others brought this forward to Pfizer management, first informally, and we were met with, informally, just talking to our managers, with, first they ignored us, and then they told us that we were hypersensitive. So then I was on the safety committee, and I brought these issues forward in the safety committee, and basically tried to solve them without going to management within the safety committee first. And if we couldn't solve them, then I said, let's formally write a document and say we needed these issues solved. They were dangerous public concern and workers' safety issues. 2 hours after the meeting, I received a note stating from a manager, quit documenting safety within the safety committee. And I was taken off that safety committee. And it was just a bizarre situation as a scientist. It was hard to realize that, oh my goodness, I couldn't believe that these people were so irresponsible. It was an ethical issue, it was a moral issue about biocontainment, and for myself, my coworkers, and you know, the public. So what I did, I wrote the head of Groton Laboratories, that's where I worked in Connecticut, and just asked her, because I thought there must be some sort of order coming from above, because it just didn't make sense that these managers were behaving this way. And sure enough, 4 months after I wrote the letter, I was called into the head of Environmental Health and Safety's office, and they told me that Pfizer runs their safety budget on what is legal and not necessarily what is safe. And that's the bottom line. And since there's no regulations on this industry, what is legal is anything that they want to do. So what was Pfizer's response to my safety complaints? Because I continued, not aggressively, but I had to continue complaining. This was an unsafe environment. It ended up that they used hostility and retaliation. I was literally put up against the wall. My performance reports dropped. Management would not come to my seminars that I would give, and I was just becoming isolated. And that was a stressful time because I knew they were retaliating against me. But the worst thing that happened was the thing that I was trying to prevent, that I became exposed to a genetically engineered virus during this time. And what happened is an untrained worker was told to use a genetically engineered infectious agent, human infectious agent, on my private workbench right next to my office where I did not have any biosafety, personal protection on.
Was told specifically to infect you using that?
No. Well, he was told, this untrained person was told to do this experiment on my bench by a manager. I immediately became ill, didn't know at the time that this was a dangerous experiment I was exposed to, because our lab had turned from BL2 lab, where you could bring in these agents, to a BL1 lab. We no longer had a biocontainment hood, so nothing should have been brought into my lab. So I didn't know why I was getting sick, and I went to the doctor, and they thought I had beginnings of multiple sclerosis, MS. And so I was struggling with that issue while still experiencing retaliation from my manager. And then a month later, I'd been to the doctor. The coworker who used the agent on my desk asked me, did I know what a lentivirus was? And I said, I know what a lentivirus is. A lentivirus is a variety of viruses. They're usually species specific. One is HIV. And he said, well, just for your own safety, I've been using a lentivirus on your bench. And I said, well, could you give, what type of lentivirus? And he said he didn't know. I said, you didn't know? He said, I was told to use do this experiment on your bench. And I said, well, could you give me, I thought he just didn't understand molecular biology, so I said, could you give me the background papers on your experiment so I could read up what he was using? He said, they didn't give me any. I mean, well, I was just like, I couldn't believe it. But so I asked him to please go check to make sure it wasn't a human infectious agent, and I said, I doubt if it is, because they wouldn't have told you to use it. And the next day he came, I was very busy, and he said, oh yes, it's completely safe, completely safe. So I ended up getting very ill, and I had to go out on medical leave. And I did not know what was going on. It was just a slow, progressive illness. I finally read one doctor's report, and in it, it had said I had some post-viral syndrome. And I said, post-viral syndrome? I didn't have the flu. I didn't know what he was talking about. But I thought, well, I was exposed to that lentivirus that they said was safe. So that's when I wrote to Pfizer. I was out on medical leave, and Pfizer. I wrote them for my exposure records for the identity of that virus he was using. Because he never told me what it was. He just said it was safe, and I thought it for sure would be safe. And then I got fired after I had that request. They fired me. And that became the big fight. I had already I had to go to OSHA. I went to OSHA and asked them for 3 things. I asked OSHA to please go in and inspect the lab so I could return to work safely. I asked them for help with my exposure records because I was sick, and it looked like that this could potentially be from an exposure that I had. And I asked them to resolve the retaliation issue against me. And that ended up to be a debacle. I mean, OSHA told me they couldn't go into Pfizer and do an inspection because they didn't have any jurisdiction. And this is when OSHA literally had documents that people were falling ill, and that a list of our safety issues which were of public concern. So they didn't go in, and they also ruled that trade secrets superseded my right to get exposure records. So I couldn't, even with the doctor's request to get the exposure records, and because Pfizer was stating they were trade secrets. So OSHA ruled and set a precedent for all biotech workers that if you get exposed, you can't get your exposure records. So I was devastated, and I was just really very ill, ambulance rides, hospitalized. Thank God I was finally hospitalized after 3 months of falling down. I was falling down to paralysis. And then after the paralysis would break, I would have severe spinal pains like I was being tasered. And the attacks would last up to 3 hours, and I could fall down in the woods. It was horrible. So they had to cart me off to the emergency room if they found me on the streets. And my husband at times would come home and have to take me too. It was really a horrible experience. So what drove me to the legal lawsuit was that I was in really desperation to get my exposure records. And so I had to file a civil claim against Pfizer in federal court to try to get them. And what happened is the judge threw out anything connected with my illness. And I did not get to even tell the jury that I was exposed or had become ill. And the judge only allowed the free speech claim and the whistleblower claim forward. At the end of the trial, I did win successfully, and that was wonderful. It was a unanimous decision. And at times when I was telling part of my story, the juries, their expression was, "You've got to be kidding me." I mean, they were just shocked. And so it really is a victory for all of us that we, the jury, the people, are concerned about public health and safety in biotech labs. And so we all should have some hope that something can be done. But my dealings with the biomedical community in trying to get my exposure records was just awful. There's so many conflicts of interest with Pfizer, with big money in universities now, that there's a lot of big business goons that come out and lie about these technologies, these dangerous technologies. Now I was building these these technologies, so I know how dangerous they are. And I guess, you know, like I said, this gives us hope that something can happen and improve for workers' rights. But, you know, as more and more biolabs within this East Bay Green Corridor are being seeded and growing, you people are at risk because we have no oversight, no regulations, and no workers' rights. So I encourage you to support, you know, enhancing workers' rights to protect the public and to protect workers.
And maybe you can talk about your experience with David Michaels and your trying to get OSHA to do oversight and what happens, particularly with OSHA.
Well, it was really horrible. When I was really sick. It was just I was incredibly ill, and OSHA wouldn't go in to do an inspection, and they ruled that trade secrets superseded my right to get exposure records. And the third thing was the retaliation. So that they did open an investigation for a whole year. At the end of 1 year, after they had all these documents of what was happening, they just dismissed my case. And I asked them, well, could you tell me why you're dismissing it? And I knew it could be dismissed because the laws are so weak. It's not that I wasn't telling you the truth or had a legitimate complaint. Just the laws are weak. But she wouldn't tell me. She wouldn't tell me why she was throwing out the case.
Was this the judge?
Oh, that's okay.
This was OSHA. It was the OSHA person. Who was that?
Marche Bryant. And I said, well, how am I supposed to appeal without knowing the issues about why you're dismissing the case? So basically, I never got the reasons until after the appeal. You should have seen my letter of appeal. I don't know why. I don't know the reasons why I was, you know, appealing because they didn't give me the reasons. So the appeal was denied. And interestingly, the guy that denied my appeal at the time was Pfizer, a Pfizer attorney. Not a Pfizer attorney. Pfizer had hired Jackson and Lewis, and he was the head of OSHA. He had worked for Jackson and Lewis. So all his conflict of interest, within the agency, you have business, you know, industry liaisons.
And who is Jackson Lewis?
Jackson Lewis is the #1 union-busting law firm in the nation. They were the head of OSHA at the time. Well, not the law firm, but someone who had worked for Jackson and Lewis they had implanted them in there.
And they were representing Pfizer at the time.
Yes. Yes.
Oh, Jackson Lewis had been head of OSHA.
Yes. But not Jackson Lewis. A man who worked for Jackson Lewis was planted into OSHA. But it was very horrible because I was, you know, falling down paralyzed, emergency room visits, in a lot of pain. And when I opened up the final letter from OSHA, they said that it's dismissed because I have a character flaw and I was out to get money. And it was so, I was just devastated. I mean, I was sick. They wrote that. They wrote that. It was just awful. I mean, I couldn't believe it. I was just so, you know, our government, I just thought there would be. So then after I won my lawsuit, a lot of people started to help me because winning a lawsuit gives you credibility. Okay, it's a big difference, and I feel so sorry for so many injured workers who struggle because the legal system is tough to even get in front of a jury, let alone, you know, winning it because the laws are so weak. So I was able to get in front of David Michaels at the time, the head of OSHA, and he said he would try to get my records from OSHA to explain what had happened. It just didn't make sense. And the records had been, he finally got them, but they had been selectively sanitized. And everything regarding Pfizer was completely out. Basically, they never did an inspection. They never did an inspection at Pfizer. They never did anything. It was all, you know, it's industry liaison driven. So it's concerning that injured workers, and especially the biotech community, that really poses a risk to the public if these if these technologies aren't biocontained, there's no place for, workers to go to get help.
And they tried to coerce you during the federal lawsuit? Your husband had dropped the suit?
Well, two months before my trial began, my husband had, at that point, worked for the FDA, and I was out of work. I was sick. I had, half of our salary was gone, our income, and my husband was supporting me both financially and medically and therapeutically because I was ill. And two months before my lawsuit, he was called into in the FDA office, and his supervisor said, "Your wife has to settle with Pfizer or you're no longer welcome here."
At the FDA?
At the FDA. And he came home, he was very disturbed, we talked about it, I was like, oh my, I couldn't believe it. Pfizer going after my spouse to try to make us settle. Because if I would settle, I couldn't talk about this. That's one of the most important things that the public needs to realize. And they put so much pressure on you to settle. Even the court system puts pressure on to settle. But I thought, it's not that I was out to get Pfizer. It was that the thought that biotech workers don't have rights for health and safety and they don't have rights for health care. This is a public health and safety issue. This could cause new emerging disease, epidemics. And if not epidemics, you have clusters of people with cancer or just what I had, a non-contagious illness that was devastating. So that was more about my speech, that the community really needs to get together and become, and talk about these issues and become aware. The community isn't even aware.
And why don't you talk a bit about, after you won the settlement, was there any national coverage, CBS or Democracy Now! Or the media? You'd think that first biotech worker working for a major drug company, Pfizer, wins a lawsuit around health and safety, free speech. Yet, what kind of coverage was there nationally?
I did get one article in the New York Times, which apparently is significant. But other than that, no. Oh, well, and also our local paper, The Day, Lee Howard, a fantastic reporter, just concerned also about workers' rights and public health and safety. He printed something, but nowhere else.
And CBS, of course, is funded by, the 16 Minutes is funded by Pfizer. Pfizer is one of the producers of Pfizer. Now, also, the agency, Pfizer, has retaliated against your husband.
After the 2 months before the lawsuit, they called him in the office and said, "Hey, your wife doesn't settle. You're out of here. We're going to get rid of you." And of course, I wasn't going to settle. And it was 4 days after I won my lawsuit. The jury claimed that Pfizer was wrong. They came after my husband like mad. I mean, gave him a reprimand, removed him from important functions of his job, and
supervision or inspection of North England compound.
Yeah, because there still was time to settle. Even though I won the lawsuit, then you had to go in other settlement discussions. They wanted to gag me badly. The biotech community does not want this to come out. So what happened is that they were really trying to terminate him, and we had to move to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and he was lucky enough to move to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and started working for a completely different agency to get out from under the retaliation. And when he was working with a completely different agency, in a whole different state, the FDA still came after him and charged him with AWOL. Because he went to a doctor's appointment or some ridiculous thing. And again, at this time, Pfizer had appealed the case, and there was still a chance to gag me. And it's just amazing how, as a whistleblower, they come after your spouse. They're so powerful in that regard, networked, I shouldn't say powerful, but networked, that it's unbelievable. I had no idea that these corporations were so networked in our government, in our academic institutes. It doesn't mean that our government's bad or academic institutes bad, but there are veins within these institutes in the power structure that are incredibly effective at silencing issues of public concern.
And what did you learn about the judge, the federal judge, Louise Bryant?
Vanessa Bryant, yeah.
Bryant, yes.
Well, during the case, I thought it was very obvious that she was biased. She wouldn't let me say the words public health and safety during my testimony. She had thrown out any part of my illness without really any credibility to do so. Well, I guess she's a judge, she can do what she wants. But I had, let me give you some background on how much evidence I had that I was exposed and became ill. As I had mentioned to you, I was working on designing these genetic missiles. Well, the only thing that I found out from Pfizer that it was a human infectious agent I had been exposed to, and the virus contained a genetic missile, shRNA, okay? When OSHA ruled that trade secrets superseded my right, I got a phone call from an OSHA person and said, okay, listen, we made a deal. Trade secrets supersede your right, but because of that, Pfizer said if you get an attorney, they'll give you the exposure records. The exposure records I'm looking for is the genetic code of the virus, because that tells you, you can read the genetic codes and it tells you what elements are in there, functional elements that can cause harm. So after a year, I had an attorney. After a year, Pfizer gave us a genetic code, but because I know how to read genetic codes, the code was not good enough for medical testing. You could tell there was errors in it. As a molecular biologist, you take my word, okay? Errors, the virus wasn't complete. And they did it on purpose, but in the code was the genetic missile, because they had to disclose that because we knew there was a genetic missile. Now at that time, I had already been hospitalized, and in the hospital, they found a potassium shift. And every time the potassium shift, I would fall down paralyzed from it went from 4.0 to 3.0 in 12 hours or something. And so that was causing my paralysis, some potassium problem. And thank God I was hospitalized, because now I can drink potassium and abort the attacks to some extent. So when they disclosed it was a human infectious agent, and then when we decoded the missile, it was a missile that attacks potassium channels. So I had concrete, substantial evidence that should have been at least presented in front of a jury. I couldn't get medical testing because the sequence wasn't appropriate for medical testing, but the functionality of looking at the genetic code has, it matched with, and I had already been diagnosed with this. It wasn't I got the genetic code and then started falling down paralyzed. It was completely kind of opposite. And unfortunately, I still have the illness. I'm much, 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 much better, thank God. But I do take medication every day. I have to take medication. So I have the illness very well managed, but it's been very hard.
But Vanessa Bryant, you had to wait?
So people even came up to me during the trial and said, she looks so biased, So it wasn't only my thought patterns on it, but afterwards she did, and I really acknowledge her for this, she did recuse herself off the case for a conflict of interest with Pfizer, with Pfizer's attorneys.
After a year?
After the trial.
The judge recused herself.
Yes, the judge recused herself. So at least she was honest that she had a conflict of interest. Because
Vanessa Bryant. And what was her conflict of interest?
her husband had business interactions with Jackson & Lewis, again, the #1 union busting.
And she knew this was going on during the trial? During the time
We could not get any information from her. I asked my attorneys, but it was, that was it, It's not much. Yep.
So, 2 questions. Presumably,
Once I left Pfizer, they didn't want me to come back. I couldn't talk to anybody. I mean, they didn't want me to come back.
Right.
I was trying to negotiate, hey, let's get these serious problems, taken care of. But no, I was completely complete that loop. But I did find out later on that people did some people did become ill. But people were ill when I was working there. People were becoming ill when I was working there, and we had that documented.
And your boss, why don't you talk about how he bullied you on the job and harassed you and put you in a corner?
Yeah, that was just a horrible incident. I walked in, I try to keep those things out of my mind, but I walked in one day and basically he just put me up against the wall and threatened that he could ruin my career. And at that time I had been told to stop documenting safety issues and all this business beforehand, and it was just frightening. The guy was like a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So, there was other things. I mean, they bullied me when I was giving seminars. He stood up one time. I mean, he was my supervisor, and you would think that you would support your scientists, but in the middle of a seminar, he stood up and degraded me for no reason, and just a whole bullying type of, you know, it was a violent, hostile act that he put me up against the wall. I was literally in a corner, and his body was you know, right. It was frightening.
Do you think the culture within some of those labs has changed one iota?
No. Pfizer shows hubris in any interaction. Even after I won it at trial, you have to go in settlement discussions, and they were just, oh, so I lost a lawsuit, and you know, no. They know they've got a lot of power. They're networked within the local communities and the national communities and the government. They don't have anything to fear. Imagine going to your family physician and say, I've been exposed to a genetically engineered virus. These physicians don't have the expertise to know. So you have to go to an institute that uses these technologies and understands them. And basically, people that work with gene therapy would understand this, or any virology lab in an academic institute. And so I went to Yale, and I was referred from a doctor, matter of fact, to go, you know. And at that time, we did not have any information about the virus other than, I believe, it was a human infectious agent. I think we knew that. But Yale sent a letter to all my doctors stating that, well, maybe one doctor, the doctor that referred, that these agents working in the lab cannot cause disease, and there's no problem, and blah, 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 blah.
Copies of that letter?
Yes, and when I got that letter, I could not believe, they didn't tell me, I got it through my doctor. Yale sent it out. And I was like, I can't believe this, because I knew it was a human infectious agent, and I knew, you know, technology is dangerous. So I made an appointment with the head of the Yale Occupational and Health Division, and he,
Who was that?
Mark Cullen. He said, your insurance company is not paying my physicians enough to deal with this, and Pfizer's giving us a lot of money at Yale. And get out of my office. Kicked us out of the office.
And you were there?
That was the first experience I had with the academic community. And I had worked in academics for a long time. And I thought very highly of academia and their approach to knowledge and science. And but since 1980s, things have changed. You know, 1980s was the Bayh-Dole Act, where it was a law that now academics have to work with private industry.
What's that act?
Bayh-Dole Act. I hope I have that right. The Bayh-Dole Act, 1980s. And so now our academic institute, there's really no free speech, because academia are profit-driven now.
Why do you spell Bayer?
I can't remember. I can't remember. Senator Bayh. Can you spell it? I can't remember.
B-A-H-Y?
B-A-Y-H.
I think that's it.
Yeah.
That looks, yeah.
Rich Pie.
Yeah.
So you were shocked about how the corporate control of academic...
Well, yeah, and Pfizer and Yale do a lot of research together. I just didn't think that those conflicts of interest, I thought a doctor was a doctor, you know, first serve your patient. Well, so I thought, well, maybe that's Yale, because Yale is right next to Pfizer. So then I made an appointment at Columbia University. And I made it with a doctor who makes genetically engineered viruses, specific. So he knew these technologies, and he knew that they were dangerous. I mean, you can't. He was using them to infect for gene therapy work. And it took like 3 months to get an appointment with him. It cost us around $900. My husband had to take us. When I went in to the appointment, that doctor didn't show up. Another doctor showed up. And without any testing, with nothing, this doctor said he wanted to, if he was going to hospitalize me, it would be in the psychiatry ward. And he wrote in his notes that I was malingering. Which means I'm not telling you the truth or something, right? Because you know what malingering? Faking. Okay, he didn't medical test me. At this time we had the genetic code of the virus, not something that could be tested, but they could, Columbia University knows how to read genetic code. And they wouldn't test me for anything. So during the lawsuit, Pfizer wanted all my medical records. I never disclosed this guy because I never agreed to see him. I agreed to see another doctor. Well, Columbia handed Pfizer this doctor's report, and Pfizer used that report to throw out my case. It's all, and Columbia University and Pfizer
gets... the case where you claimed you were made ill.
Yes, because there's... Yeah. Okay. Yes. Now, I had already been to workers' comp, okay, because most injured workers do not have rights to file a lawsuit for illness unless it's with intent, okay? If an employer with intent, willful and wanton misconduct or intent, and then you get sick, then you have a right. So I was claiming they were willful and wanton. I had put these safety issues, they were documented. They didn't do anything about them. I got exposed. It was willful. And why they used an infectious agent out on the bench is beyond me. I mean, that's sheer stupidity. Yeah, it's sheer stupidity. So,
do you believe, I mean, it's a strong implication that they intentionally put that there to infect you.
well, the only person that can answer that is the supervisor who put me up against the wall and told that untrained technical staff person to use that agent. I don't know. I can't, you know. Yeah.
Now, one question. What kind of protection you were not in a non-union situation?
Yes.
No union. But what kind of protection should workers have, health and safety workers have in the industry to protect their rights? So you're not retaliated against.
Well,
you found out you didn't have any protection.
Right.
In these committees.
Well, free speech is very important. We should be able, without this culture of intimidation and threats against losing our jobs, be able to speak freely. And listen, good science is good safety, especially with molecular biology and these type of advances. If you don't understand the safety, you don't understand the science. That's just the bottom line. So it's important sometimes when you work on projects to talk about safety. You have to. You're like, oh, well, I have this virus and it's coded with this, and where's the risk assessment, and you know. So you have to do a good risk assessment. What protections? So free speech, just to talk about it. But we also need a forum. One of the things that was bizarre is that not only I was bringing up issues about safety, but my coworkers. There was no forum. I mean, I bring it to the safety committee. They told me you're off the safety committee. And I went to OSHA. I said, well, how can you say legally they can tell me to get off the safety committee? There's no regulations. They don't have to have a safety committee. And if they do, they don't have to have people like me on it. They could have middle managers who are Pfizerites, you know. A forum that workers can really at least document it, and they have to be addressed. And if they're not addressed, then the public needs to be aware. Immediately the public should be aware. There needs to be some sort of, okay, you're not going to address these, well then it goes on public record.
And risk assessment, they said that they didn't do risk assessment?
No, they said they did a risk assessment, but they didn't do adequate risk assessments. Again, if you're ordered to do a risk assessment, you have to have some sort of guidelines of how to do it. As a molecular biologist and a scientist, I would know how to look at a genetically engineered agent or look at something and decide how it should be biocontained, either biocontainment 2, 3, or 4. You know, there's different levels of biocontainment. And this should be discussed within the project that you're working on. And so the risk assessment isn't a 50-page document. It can be 1 to 2 pages, just understanding the science. So they didn't do a risk assessment, basically.
And they're not required to, you discovered. If you have a federal contract, if you're a federal contractor, like a university, you're required to do a risk assessment. But in the case of a private company that doesn't get public money, the requirements are different for risk assessments.
So there's no regulations on private industry? There's no regulations? No,
So
there's no
requirement that they do risk assessments in the biotech industry?
Not on BL2 agents. BL3 they might. I don't work with let me explain. BL2, BL1 are agents you're working with, or genetic material or DNA that will really not cause you any harm. So you can work on the open bench. You don't need a biological hood. When you go up to bio level 2, now you're working in a biocontainment hood at all. And these agents can cause serious illness, but aren't supposed to kill you. Okay, so I was exposed to apparently a BL2, BL3 agent, kind of in between. Because I can tell you the details later. But then the BL3 are agents that can kill you, but there's antidote, like anthrax. Okay, anthrax you can kill, but you have an antidote. BL4 levels is like Ebola. You're dead. You get exposed, you're dead. But BL2 labs is still very dangerous technologies being used, and the public's not aware of that. And if they're released, the public can become ill. And I want to let you know that you might be sitting there thinking, oh, it'll never happen to me, it'll never happen to me. That's what I thought. I was very safety conscious. Who would ever think that I would have ever been exposed to a genetically engineered virus?
And last part, there was a biological cabinet that was leaking into the air, and what happened with that? They buried it, and the community was affected potentially with the contaminants that were being released?
Well, during the time that I was raising safety complaints, all of a sudden, my lab people started becoming ill in my lab, and we discovered it was the biocontainment hood where you use genetically engineered viruses or other biological materials. When you turned on the hood, an exhaust would come out, and it was making people sick. Vomiting, diarrhea, headaches. So we would have to evacuate the lab, and Pfizer was not addressing the issue. We knew that what was causing our illness was contained in the filter within the biocontainment hood. So all Pfizer had to do was take the filter out and get it tested. What's in there that's causing? They wouldn't do it. They refused to do it. And so finally, we wrote a note. Went forward to management saying that, hey, something has to be done. It was a whole year. We were getting sick. I was getting sick. I had to evacuate the lab. I had tons of work to do. I had to get out of the lab, otherwise I would, start vomiting. So what Pfizer did one day, we're in our lab, and all of a sudden there's a knock at the door. Knock, knock, knock. I opened the door, and there are 2 guys dressed in complete biohazard suits with their own oxygen supply. And the environmental health and safety manager was there and said, would you please step out? And my supervisor and I looked at each other, we stepped out. They went in, they never discussed, and they said they're testing the hood. Well, their test was a total, purposely bogus test. We knew where the problem was with the hood. It was in the filter with the exhaust. And they put the probe not even close to the exhaust and tested it. They put it inside the hood where you wouldn't get the agent coming out. And so it's unbelievable what was going on. And then they couldn't solve the problem, so what did they do? They plugged the exhaust out into the Groton community, where they knew it made people sick. So, take my word, there are issues here, and completely illegal. These the biotech industry is under no regulations. It really is a public health and safety issue. Question is why, there's knowledgeable people and scientists at Pfizer, why wouldn't Pfizer take care of safety? I mean, that was my big question, because I was like, this doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. But as I mentioned, I went all the way to the head honcho that was overseeing 6,000 scientists, and I asked her, Nancy Hudson, and I asked her, how are you prioritizing this safety budget? Because we in our department are having scientists unnecessarily exposed to agents, and people are even becoming ill. And her reply was, Pfizer bases their safety policy on what's legal and not necessarily what is safe. And that's, the woman that told me that, who was the head of the Environmental Health and Safety Department, even apologized. She said, Becky, I'm very sorry. That's how Pfizer runs their program. Other people have been in here with your same complaints. There's nothing I can do. I looked at her, I thought, oh my gosh, what kind of job, you know, a very intelligent, professional woman having
5,000 Hudson.
6,000.
6,000 under her.
So it would have cost Pfizer maybe $20,000 to give us a laboratory break room that would have been separate from all these dangerous elements. It might have cost a little bit more to make an office space for all of us, so we wouldn't have people doing experiments right next to us. Now, some of these biotechnologies is fine. You can have your office right next to someone doing an experiment, but if you're bringing in human infectious agents of any kind, I don't care what kind of safety mechanisms they have on them, you shouldn't have scientists in the lab doing office work. So it's all, and I even reported to OSHA that you're having top-level managers that probably know nothing about biology making decisions about safety.
So there's no scientists at the top?
Well, they're chemists or something, or they're salespeople that made it all the way to the top. You know, they're not molecular biologists. You need virologists, molecular biologists, or a physician that could understand the technologies. But again, not all physicians.
Well, you talked to David Michaels and explained this situation to him with biotechnology and the need to have proper trained personnel to do oversight in the industry. And what was Dr. Michaels' response to you of OSHA, that there wasn't a real proper oversight of professional people to
Well, I don't know if he actually, we discussed that in great detail, because at the time I was trying to get my records from OSHA to figure out, but he wrote in the New York Times that there's just no regulations. There's no adequate regulations on the they don't have laws to monitor it, which I think is a false statement. There's a general clause law. What is it, general duty? Yeah, they could use a general duty clause and go in there and do an inspection. They just, it's all, didn't want to.
And when did he tell you this? How long ago was this?
I think it was in 2009, before
2009.
or after, I can't remember. It was late, it was after. Yeah.
Has there been any legislation to strengthen OSHA and to strengthen oversight of the biotech and nanotech labs so
No,
that there's protection for
there's
the American
nothing.
people?
My story's been pretty much hush. It's hard to get it out. The newspapers don't pick it up. I mean, I know it's incredible.
Coverage was in Korea. What happened with that? The Korean Pfizer story,
I didn't.
where you spoke in support of a Korean biotech worker at Pfizer. Remember, there was an article in the Korean newspaper.
Well, I can't remember how that.
Because they were protesting the treatment of
workers at
Pfizer in Korea. So the Korean Times had a story about your case.
Oh,
that was the first story, international story. So if you look at it, it was in Korea.
Yeah.
We had a Korea Pfizer facility, not in Groton, Connecticut, where Pfizer is based. And you you sent a letter of solidarity to them.
Yeah, I tell you, I would be very concerned about having a biotech company in my neighborhood without regulations. Because it's all about money, isn't it? I mean, that's what's going on. I was just as shocked as anybody, and that's why I almost self-doubted myself. I'm like, I cannot believe this. I mean, finding a genetically engineered virus where we eat and drink and they won't do anything? They won't even have a meeting with all our workers saying, hey, watch where you put your genetically engineered viruses? Nothing? Oh, you're hypersensitive, Becky. One guy, we kept finding a carcinogen where we eat and drink. It's called ethidium bromine. You use it a lot in molecular laboratories to stain DNA. And it's a known carcinogen. And I said, listen, we have to, we're having problems with this issue. And he said, oh, I worked with that as a graduate student. I don't have cancer yet. I mean, I looked at him like, you've got to be kidding me. I mean, these responses were so shocking. I started self-doubting myself. But that's why I just had to go to the head and just ask her what's going on. Because these men and women were smart people. They knew it was dangerous, and they were frightened to lose their job. I was really shocked that as a scientist and my ethical responsibilities as a scientist, I'm just shocked at how they treated these safety issues of public concern. And as a scientist, I I thought literally when I started working for Pfizer, I knew they were making money, and as a matter of fact, they have some patents of mine. And I didn't mind because I thought they would be using those technologies to better the health of the nation, But that's not how it works. It's doing science to make money. It's no prioritization. I didn't know that. I was a little bit naive about how corporations, run. But
well, we had some long discussion with our friend Niall Ferguson about doing corporate science as opposed to doing pure science.
What does this mean for our society and the world, not just here but around the world, that in these new technologies, biotech, nanotech, that are being developed at great expense and money that's going into it, billions of dollars all over the world, that there is no regulation, and that the development of these technologies and these products present a potential extreme threat to life, to human life and our society. What does that mean?
Well, I have no doubt that it's already impacted the community to some extent. But you can't trace it. If you don't have a genetic code, and if a cluster of people in a community comes down with cancer, a certain cancer that's caused by a genetically engineered virus, it would be very difficult to track it back to a lab unless you were able to isolate that virus. And that's not necessarily easy. A virus doesn't have to go into your blood necessarily to cause some harm. It could, for me, what happened, I no doubt had touched my hands with the experiment, and then I went to my computer and I probably put my hands in my mouth or touched half of my face went numb. So it went up to my trigeminal nerve into my nervous system, and that's why I kept having spinal pain and all kinds of horrible things. But it's, if you look at even the swine flu that occurred, I think it was in 2009 or something. When they pulled that swine flu out and analyzed it, it had 4 different viruses in it. And that's very indicative of a genetically engineered virus. There was an avian sequence in there, there was a human sequence, and then there was 2 swine sequences from different areas of the world. And I'm sure these things have been released, and I'm sure they've caused the community harm, but it's hard to track it down. It's this mystery cluster of people that come down with illness, or we need epidemiologists to really start looking into these matters. In an oncogenic region or anything, you've got cancer. Or they could cause cancer by the expression of the genetically engineered element that's been cloned in, or metabolic disorders, or neurological disorders, all different varied problems.
And you went to workers' comp in Connecticut because you needed health care. What was your experience at Connecticut workers' comp? What happened there?
They had the exposure records in their hand. It was during a deposition, and we asked to get a copy, and the administrative judge came in and ruled that workers' compensation had no jurisdiction to order those records for my health care. And that was the end of workers' compensation.
And then workers...
I have to kind of give a background. So during this, workers' compensation is supposed to be a non-litigious, situation.
Situation.
Yeah.
If you get hurt on the job, you get taken.
If you get hurt on the job, you're supposed to be taken care of without a big lawsuit or anything. Well, my first time I go in front of the workers' comp, 4 Pfizer's attorneys show up. before Pfizer, and my attorney turned to me and said, Becky, I've never seen anything like this before. And the judge came in, and I literally saw his knees shaking. He was frightened of those Pfizer's attorneys, and that's why he said, I don't have jurisdiction to order. And my doctor had ordered them. My doctor had written a note to Pfizer, we need those records. She's had exposure, there's a possible risk that she's been ill from it. It's just, it's all conflicts of interest. These judicial judges on the workers' comp, it's a political appointment, you can get fired. Okay, you can get fired. It's not like a lifetime thing. So.
And Pfizer said they didn't have those records. They hadn't been keeping records of all.
Oh, okay. So initially they said trade secret supersedes my right. They couldn't give me the trade secret. I knew it wasn't a trade secret because I had been working on the project where this virus had been used. I didn't know the genetic code, but when you work on these projects, you can work cross disciplines with other scientists. And I knew that this agent was not a trade secret. It was used as a positive control for an experiment. So Pfizer kept Pfizer told OSHA it was a trade secret. Pfizer told workers' compensation it was trade secret. When we got to the federal court system, thank God one of the judges ordered Pfizer to give me my exposure records. They ordered them. Under the United States, federal judge, good federal judge. No, it was a federal judge, one of a judge that worked for, I guess, Vanessa Bryant. I guess, there's layers of judges as you go through these lawsuits. It's very interesting. I didn't know that myself. But he ordered Pfizer, and then Pfizer said, I don't have them. I don't have the records. Sorry, we don't have them. Well, they had already claimed that was a trade secret. You can't have a claim secret without records. So they lied to a federal investigation. So you either have the records as a trade secret or you don't have the records. Oh, we don't have the records. Well, anyone that doesn't have these records is doing unethical science. Because if one of these agents are released, you really, think about AIDS. Remember all these people were falling down with AIDS. You know how long it took for them to discover the AIDS virus, to even isolate the AIDS virus? So, it wasn't like, oh, you're sick, you got a virus. It takes a while to find these agents. So not having the records alone is just unethical. It should be illegal.
And Lyme disease, there's in Connecticut, Plum Island, people have been sick there. Many people have contacted you about symptoms that they've had. Who's following up? I've talked to many people from Connecticut who actually have Lyme disease. They didn't even know it started in Connecticut, at Lyme, Connecticut. Yeah,
I was glad to leave Connecticut because of that. There was really a lot of people, the Lyme disease, a lot of people are contracting Lyme disease, and again, it's a very difficult disease to diagnose, and the phenotypic outcome of the illness is varied, So it's difficult to diagnose, and it's difficult to isolate the Lyme spirochete. So all these people ill, and they can't get an accurate diagnosis. And there's ticks everywhere in Connecticut. Oh, I'm so glad I left there. I was like, the last hike I took in Connecticut, each dog had 16 ticks on them, and I had 4 crawling on me. And I was like, oh, I got to get out of here. It was just too much.
In Connecticut is named after the disease because there was an epidemic at this town of Lyme in Connecticut. The town of Lyme is 30 miles from Plum Island, where they were doing research, biological warfare research
on the spirochete
on these animals, Nazis. No.
It's Lyme, Connecticut.
No, it's Lyme, Connecticut.
Because that's where they discovered
the disease in Lyme, Connecticut, because there was an epidemic in Lyme, Connecticut. The amazing thing in this country, and I've met them, I met people from Connecticut who have Lyme disease and didn't know where Lyme disease started, where it was discovered. And it was discovered in a town which is 30 miles from this island.
Called Old Lyme.
It's this island where this laboratory was, this military laboratory, FDA laboratory, which is now being sold off and apparently going to be developed.
Yeah, that's what I hear.
Plum Island is now going to be developed. So they were doing biological war research on developing agents biological war agents at this island, Plum Island, 30 miles from Lyme, Connecticut. And now it's being privatized. It's going to be turned over to some private developer for development as an island. And yet, it seemed, where did this disease come from? It did not exist
Yeah.
in the United States and the world until it was discovered in Lyme, Connecticut, which is close to this laboratory where they're doing these biological testing.
There's no doubt that these advanced technologies that are being developed in biolabs can cause new emerging disease. They can cause diseases that are already out there and new emerging disease. But you won't hear that from anybody from a biotech industry or the biomedical industry saying that. They say, oh, it's completely safe, and miracle cures here and miracle cures there, and it's just disgusting. The ethics within our scientific community, I'm shocked. You know, when I first started working in academic labs, it wasn't like that. But that was right during the time this Bayh-Dole Act passed. And I'll never forget this professor that I worked with. He was a very, very smart man. And I remember, and he was running a big international lab, at Baylor College of Medicine. And I'll never forget him saying, I wonder what this is going to do to academia. Because the first group of industry had come in to discuss biotech transfer. And it has changed the face of our academic community, where we do not have free speech in our academic community. It's a very serious issue. If anybody speaks out, and there's evidence of it, there's people in California that have tried to speak out about genetically... David Bell, but also, I'm sorry, I can't remember his name. He's a professor at Berkeley. He spoke out, and he got about genetically engineered corn in Mexico, how it had... Ignacio, I'm sorry, I just can't remember. And he really, the university came down on him. I can't remember.
Maybe you could talk about the case of David Bell. This is a case in California where a biotech worker at AgroQuest, owned by Pam Marone, was worried about contamination at the lab.
Well, the time that I went on the internet, I was told they isolate you once you're retaliated against, and you're totally isolated. You can't find doctors. You can't, nothing. And I went on the internet just desperately searching, and I found a story about David Bell. And David Bell I was a career molecular biologist, 23 years. David just went into the biotech industry as a nascent. Technician is a new. A new technician, and he was just finished up his college degree, and he was able to get a job at a biotech agricultural facility, and they made him clean out big fermentation vats because they were growing agents. And he cleaned it out, didn't give him personal protection, nothing. And he became violently ill. He's had 7 surgeries. He got apparently infected by these agents. Pus coming out of his nasal passage. It was just awful, awful. And he went through the same problems that I did. But he didn't have anything documented. He wasn't on the safety committee. I was pretty smart in at least having documentation that he didn't have much documentation, and they just railroaded him and kicked him to the curb. No medical care, he had to go on disability. Most of the injured workers have to go on disability because they're not taken care of within the workers' comp. And it's a horrible situation, especially for a young man like that that's starting a new career, and to experience that, just the isolation and just kicked to the curb. And in America, who would ever think that these type of things could happen? Because you have to know that you had an exposure. If you just come down with an illness, how do you know that was, at least I knew I had a documented exposure, and it was documented in a notebook of what he was using. So, but how would you know? It's just very difficult. That's why you have to biocontain these things and make sure they're biocontained.
And this
if you look at the statistics of biotech workers getting infected, the vast majority never knew they had an exposure. Okay, they never knew they had an exposure. Now, these were documented cases. Who just died of the plague? a couple,
Oh, in Chicago.
yeah.
What's the guy's name?
Joni Chow's
Chow's husband.
I'm sorry, I can't. So he died of the plague. He didn't know he had an exposure. Most people don't, because you know, in the culture of when you're working with these elements, they're this small. You're working with a test tube. So I could be working with an infectious agent, and right next to me, it could be completely innocuous in the same looking tube. So you don't know. You don't know who's working what with what next to you, and you don't know if you've been exposed or not.